Hey everyone, welcome to Be the Change. My name is Lily Mott, and today I'm going to be talking about how change comes when you find how you want to contribute. My guest today is Ilana Cohen, and she is a climate activist, a co founder of Campus Climate Network, and she is currently a Fulbright Scholar in Peru. I got to talk with Ilana about her work in the climate justice movement, and we could have talked for so much longer because she is very passionate about this issue. So, without further ado, let's dive into this episode featuring Ilana Cohen.
My name's Ilana Cohen. I take she, her pronouns. I have been involved in the climate movement since I was in high school, and I've always been really passionate about political action that makes a change in our everyday lives in our local communities and really brings together people and planet. So I've been politically involved since as early as I can remember. Currently, I'm based in Lima, Peru. I'm doing a Fulbright scholarship in affiliation with the national nonprofit legal environmental advocacy organization, Sociedad Peruana de Derecho Ambiental. And I am also recently graduated from Harvard, where I spent years helping lead the fossil fuel divestment movement. And when I get back to the US, I'll be starting at NYU Law with the goal of pursuing strategic climate change litigation and policymaking.
That is such a great place to get started, and I'm really excited to talk with you. So tell me about what got you started with this work. What made you want to get involved in the climate justice movement in the first place?
Yeah. When I was 12 years old, I experienced Hurricane Sandy in my home city of New York. I had never before consciously experienced climate disaster, but when Sandy struck, I was stuck inside our Brooklyn apartment for about a week. I couldn't go to school. I remember being terrified. I stockpiled flashlights and canned food under the living room table. And I was so paranoid about all of my family staying safe. And I remember that when I finally emerged from the storm, what actually struck me was how little damage I saw in my neighborhood, which was relatively okay just because of the way it's geographically positioned. There were some downed trees and some damage, but it was nothing like what I saw in images that were published of the Rockaways, Queens, for example, which is just a train ride away from me or a subway ride away from me. And understanding like the difference between how my neighborhood in Brooklyn was affected versus how neighborhoods in Queens or even just other neighborhoods in Brooklyn, frankly, that were closer to the water than mine were gravely affected. And then also seeing the real continued failure of our government to respond to the needs of those communities was very eye-opening for me. It was my first real taste in my home city of climate injustice. And it was a very mobilizing moment. I really was always politically active, always passionate about working with my neighbors and like people in my community broadly defined as like, honestly, the whole of the city to make a real change in the policies that affected our daily lives. But climate was something that I kind of like learned more and more about over time, like first with Sandy, and then in high school when I ended up taking an environmental politics course my senior year, it really came through to me how much climate change and climate injustice actually intersected with every form of social injustice and every form of inequality that I had been trying to confront through more conventional political organizing and activism and local democratic work my whole life. So I became really inspired when I learned about the efforts of Zero Hour, which is a youth-led climate justice coalition. And they were planning at the time the first ever youth climate march in the summer of 2018 in Washington, D.C. And when I learned about them in this class I was taking at my public high school, Beacon, I thought to myself, why can't we do the same thing here? So I got in touch with Zero Hour and I ended up co-founding the New York City chapter of the organization and co-leading the New York City version of the first ever youth climate march, which was actually the inspiration for the youth climate strikes led by Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg. And that was when, from that moment onward, I just knew okay, there's no way I can like move forward with making a real difference unless climate is being addressed. And this is how I want to do it. For me, climate really is the through line of everything. Climate justice is at the heart of everything. Because if we're going to be able to move forward with literally like any meaningful issue, housing, education, health, then we have to invest in tackling the climate crisis, and we have to invest in doing it in a way that is equitable, and that puts first the communities who are being most affected and who have the fewest resources, because that's the only way actually that we tackle this problem. And those communities often have the solutions too, and they're just not listened to. And also because I think what people often don't realize is that climate injustice is part of a fossil fuel dominated economy, not just in the sense that it's the inevitable outcome of fossil fuel dependence, but also it's like part and parcel of the way that fossil fuel companies operate and lobby against climate action, lobby against policies that would allow us to share a more just and sustainable future. And so until that kind of level of corporate influence and corruption of our politics and our policy making is addressed, there's also no way to move forward with addressing, again, any of the injustices and inequalities that are so fundamentally tied to whether or not we're able to enjoy the fundamental right to a stable climate, a healthy environment, and futures, meaningful futures.
Absolutely, yeah. So tell me about your work with Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard. Can you tell me about what your experience was like being involved with that movement and I think really leading that movement? I think this is such a tangible example of real change being made in real time, and I would love to know what that whole campaign was like for you.
Awesome. Yeah. So right after I had helped lead one of the first youth climate marches in the summer of 2018, I had just graduated from high school and I was preparing to start college at Harvard. So I came to Harvard's campus with this deep excitement about continuing the climate justice organizing I've been doing. I was riding a high from the success of the youth climate marches. And I had started doing preliminary research around how I could get involved in similar struggles at Harvard, obviously understanding that Harvard is such a privileged and powerful institution that what it does with respect to climate has resounding effects, not only on other higher education institutions, but also on institutions of all sorts, not only across the country, but also across the world. And I just knew that I had to leverage the privilege of being a Harvard student, being part of this institution's community, to make a difference in that respect. And I ended up finding in my research all of this information about the Divest Harvard campaign. However, when I came to campus, I quickly realized that this campaign that had made headlines before and seemed so vibrant effectively ceased to exist because all the original organizers, except for 1 to 2 people, had graduated out. The students who had been organizing were gravely disillusioned with the pushback they faced from the administration after years of organizing with no tangible wins. And so I became very determined to understand why it was that this movement that felt so important, so critical at this moment in time, particularly because again this was right after youth were starting to mobilize in historic numbers for climate. It was also in the middle of the Trump administration, so we were seeing dramatic rollbacks on climate and environmental policy. Why it was that this movement was no longer there. And so I actually ended up starting to write an article called The Death of Divestment for the Harvard Political Review. And in the process, I realized that this movement really couldn't die. This is the one time I would say I really broke the rule for journalists, broke my rule, of course, as like a reporter, and was like, okay, I actually just can't do this. In the process of writing the article, I realized this is a movement that has to be revived. The end process can't be the death of the movement. And so I started coming together with just a handful of peers who were similarly passionate about taking up this tactic that is so storied, that is rooted in struggles against apartheid South Africa and struggles against big tobacco and struggles against arms companies and human rights abuses. And we decided to rebirth the movement, which we then renamed to Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard, and ended up inspiring this sort of surge in fossil fuel divestment activism as a result, across campuses all around the United States and even beyond in other countries as well, which is so exciting. So, but we started as literally like a very small crew. Like there were like 5 of us in weekly meetings, and we just kept talking to people, kept working. I organized our first major action in the spring of 2019, and quickly began to like build up a real following on our campus and outside of our campus. And I'm happy to talk more about like some of the bigger actions we did and how the campaign went, because obviously we ended up winning, which is great. But that's sort of the origin story of the second wave of the fossil fuel divest Harvard campaign, and I would actually say the second wave of the fossil fuel divestment movement on U.S. college campuses.
Yeah, definitely. I would love for you to kind of continue on with this story and share more about this movement and your work at Harvard. I think this is such an interesting and important story. So I would love for you to continue on and share more details.
Sure. Okay, so in the spring of 2019, we staged our first action, which was called Harvard Heat Week, and was like a tribute to the original Harvard Heat Week, which had happened in 2015, was put on by the first version of the campaign. And it was deeply invigorating, but it was also a moment of learning for us, as it's important for all student organizers, because we realized that we needed to think more out of the box of the types of actions we put on, because even though we did succeed in having a really great rallying moment for folks on campus, it didn't feel like what we were doing was meeting the moment for the stakes of the climate emergency. And also in a moment where we were continuing to see already the intransigence of the next Harvard administration, which at the time was the administration of Lawrence Bacow, who's no longer currently president. So we started to get really, really creative. And as our numbers grew, it also became easier to stage larger actions. But the action we became most famous for, and which truly was a turning point for the divestment movement as a whole, it was the largest fossil fuel divestment student protest in history, was when we stormed the field of the Harvard-Yale football game in November of 2019. And it was an action that started with our really just having a meeting, getting together, putting our heads together, thinking, what can we do that is really out of the box, that will challenge people to think in their daily lives about the meaning of these major universities sustaining the fossil fuel industry and being complicit in the maintenance of an unjust, unsustainable fossil fuel economy. And we realized that there was a very unique opportunity at this game where there would already be national media attention, where there would already be vast swaths of the Harvard and Yale communities in attendance, to put on an action that would really provoke people to think more deeply and challenge the universities in a very public way to show climate leadership and to stop being climate laggards. And so we at Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard spent months coordinating with students who were part of the Fossil Fuel Divestment campaign at Yale. And we originally planned for 120 of us to storm the field, 120 of us who had undergone civil disobedience training, many of whom we, the principal organizers, had, recruited through one-on-one coffee talks and dining hall meals and over the course of months. And everyone was really excited and ready and also prepared for the risks that doing this entailed, because we knew it was an arrestable action and we felt very strongly that it was important to carry out. And we also in advance, talked to media outlets and planned to get news coverage, but it was a really big gamble that we were taking, that people would like this action. And when the moment came and we ended up storming the field, the result was just unbelievably incredible. Truly, it was something we had never seen before. I think it was something that has never been seen before, really, in the context of the divestment movement, which is that hundreds of people started pouring down from the stands of the game to join us. They saw what we were doing and they weren't just, acknowledging it or passively supporting it. They actively wanted to be part of the movement. And I remember literally having tears like stream down my cheeks just watching this happen, feeling my heartbeat, because it was something I could have never expected. And it made that moment that would have already been for sure like a novel moment, an important one, even more special, even more unique, and even more resounding, because we ended up making international headlines and really putting the universities in a new position where they fundamentally had to confront the push for fossil fuel divestment, for climate justice in their institutional policies, in the way that they chose to invest. And that story of our action, it made the New York Times, it made outlets all over the world. We saw people that day risk arrest and actually be arrested who had never even planned to join us, because they simply believed so much in what we were doing. And that was really also the start of, I think, a new level of momentum within the fossil fuel divestment movement, because after we did that action, we had campaigns from all over the country reaching out to us, asking us how they could stage powerful actions, how they could reinvigorate the call for divestment on their campuses. And that was really the beginning of what then became a very serious and intense years-long process that culminated in our success of getting Harvard to agree to divest its endowment from fossil fuels. Okay, that's that. I can also talk to, like, there's 1 to 2 more specific things I could say about how we got them to divest, if that's of interest, like just skipping ahead to like closer to when they actually did.
Yes, definitely. Keep sharing details. I think I'm really just enjoying hearing this whole story. So definitely tell me more.
Cool. So after Harvard Yale, which again is a turning point and led to a massive surge in membership in our campaign, massive surge in fossil fuel divestment activism across the country, we started to think really seriously again about how we could build on the momentum we were creating. And there were many tactics we employed. We did many more creative actions. For example, we staged a mock oil spill. We wrote tons of op-eds. We worked with many different social justice organizations on and off campus and built coalitions and brought together faculty, students, alumni. But by the time that, I want to say, the pandemic rolled around and students were forced to leave campus, we were still in a position where Harvard had not made the decision to divest. And we also lost the ability to do in-person actions, which was very difficult. So we had to adapt our organizing, like many campaigns at this time, to a digital world. And part of what we did was we utilized that opportunity to write and file a very novel and very important legal complaint against the university, charging that its investments contradicted its duties under state law. Because under state law, under a law that exists in almost all states in the US called MIFA, there it's the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, just for folks who aren't familiar with it. Institutions that are charitable, right? Charitable corporations have actually a responsibility legally to invest in ways that align with their charitable mission. And since Harvard, as a higher education institution, is actually treated as considered under state law to be a charitable corporation, they had this obligation. And it was clear to us that, you know, a charitable mission of higher education, of serving young people, preparing them for their futures, being a leader in scholarship and knowledge that betters the world, that in no way aligned with investing in the fossil fuel industry as it continued to undermine climate policy and put at stake the very futures of the people that Harvard was claiming to serve, its students. So we filed this legal complaint in the spring of 2021, and it ended up inspiring a whole ton of folks at other schools, other campuses, and even at other kinds of funds to take similar legal action. We also initially got the idea from folks at Boston College who we've been working with. And what the university got really, really scared. I mean, we filed this complaint with the state attorney general's office. We met with that office multiple times, and we knew the merits of our arguments. And in fall 2021, Harvard announced that it would commit to divesting its endowment from the fossil fuel industry. And in that announcement, it actually utilized language that effectively parroted the language from our legal complaint, saying it was not prudent to have these investments. So it was really vindicating for us to see that in Harvard's own words, Harvard was confessing that it had been in the wrong and that it needed to correct the way it was going about its investments in order to really fulfill its espoused mission and its climate commitments. So that was a huge victory. And of course, you know, in the 7 weeks alone after Harvard made that announcement that it would divest its endowment, we saw a dozen other institutions make similar divestment pledges. So it was a victory, not just for us, not just for the broader community we organize with, for all the students, faculty, alumni, community members, public figures who put time into this campaign, but really for our whole country, for our whole world, for everyone advocating for institutions to do better on climate, and to make meaningful commitments to investing in and building up a just and sustainable world.
I think this story is such an important one to share with young people, especially college students who are living on their campuses and want to make institutional change within their campuses. So thank you so much for sharing that. Lots of young people want to create change, but they may not know how to get started with that work. What advice do you have for those people who may be listening?
That's such a good question. I think that everyone has a role in the climate movement. And the way to start getting involved is to think about the way that you want to contribute. What are your skills? What are your passions? What are you interested in? Are you someone who wants to do communications work and help, grassroots campaigns get out their messages about why it's important to divest from fossil fuels or take other forms of climate action? Are you someone who likes to plan events, to plan actions? Are you someone who wants to spend time facilitating organizing meetings? I think everyone has a role to play, and the important thing is that people find ways to leverage who they are as unique people to make their own contribution in a way that is personally rewarding, as well as meaningfully adding to the work that is being done. And in that respect, I also really encourage folks to look for organizations that already exist that could always use more support, rather than to start with thinking about creating their own effort. It's very important to be inspired to create your own climate initiative if you feel that's the best way you can contribute. But there are so many incredible organizations out there that really just need more people, that need you to bring your skills, your knowledge, your background, your perspective. And so you should be willing to just take the first step of reaching out to them, sign up for that mailing list, go to the first meeting, look for them on your social media. There's so many organizations, countless ones. I honestly couldn't even come close to naming them all, but I'll just name one that I've worked with, which is the Campus Climate Network. So for students on university campuses, or for anyone who is affiliated with an academic institution, the Campus Climate Network is a nonprofit organization that is training up and coordinating folks at academic institutions all across the country and even outside of the United States to expose and dismantle fossil fuel industry influence in academia and in higher education, and particularly in climate research that goes on to affect climate policymaking. So basically, this is the Fossil Fuel Divestment Plus Hub, the next level of the fossil fuel divestment movement. And Campus Climate Network could use all the folks who are willing to join its efforts to do so.
I really enjoyed talking with Ilana, and it was great to hear the story behind Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard. Ilana is so involved with the climate justice movement, and I think her story is a great testament to how change comes when you find how you want to contribute. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and you can find Ilana on Instagram at IlanaBana to get connected with her and follow along with all of the work she's doing. If you want to talk about anything I mentioned, please reach out to me by email at lily@bethechangepodcast.org or on Instagram at Be The Change Media Network. I am working on expanding Be The Change Media Network, which means bringing you more inspiring stories from amazing guests. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could leave the podcast a rating and a comment, because it will help these stories to reach, educate, and inspire more people. And I would also love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Tune in for my next episode, but until then, be the change you wish to see in the world. Bye, guys.